For a conversation on America's gun crisis, please welcome Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, and Ryan Busse, author of Gunfight, My Battle Against the Industry That Radicalized America, and a senior advisor at Giffords. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Mark Leibovich.
Hi all, thanks for being here. Wow, packed house, I like it. Senator Murphy, Ryan, thanks for coming to this. We don't have enough time, so let's get right to it. You running for president, Senator?
Joe Biden is running for president,
Okay.
so I'll be supporting him.
What if he doesn't run?
What if he doesn't run? Maybe someday, but
Okay.
I got teenagers at home. They're not interested in me running for president.
Maybe someday. That made news, right? Anyway, this is not the reason we're here today. We are here to talk about the gun violence problem in America. It's obviously been a kind of very busy summer for everyone up here. Landmark legislation, biggest gun legislation really in 20, 30 years, a few decades. A lot of people dissatisfied, a lot of people celebrating it. Net plus didn't go far enough, and here we are. I will start with the senator. If there was anything you could have gotten in this bill that was realistic that you didn't get, what would you have got? What would you have wished for?
Start with what wasn't in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, listen. Still to this day, the most popular policy and the most impactful is expanding the background check system. We did that in this bill, right? We, knocked out a whole bunch of domestic violence offenders that won't be able to get guns. We sort of tweaked the language around who has to register as a licensed dealer, so we'll do more background checks through that change. But really, we should have universal background checks at the minimum. We should have universal commercial background checks in this nation. It's super popular. I wish we had gotten that done.
Ryan, you live in Montana, you're steeped in the gun culture, a very different world than the one we're accustomed to here. What was your general takeaway from this legislation when you saw it was in it, what you saw when it wasn't in it, and also being part of it as it's in its inception?
Well, first off, we should thank Senator Murphy. Without his dedication and dogged determination, we would have had no bill. I don't think there's any debate about that. As far as, yes, thank you. I think what's important is perhaps not what's in this bill, but how it helps reestablish social norms in and around gun ownership and gun safety that were once very ubiquitous in our country and in the firearms industry. I spent 25 years in the firearms industry. And it wasn't that long ago that the industry itself would not allow tactical gear like that worn and researched by the Buffalo shooter and worn by the Uvalde shooter. And the guns that they used would not allow those to be displayed at its own trade shows. Only about 15, 17 years ago, the industry itself, and that was a voluntary prohibition. And you think about how those norms have been broken to where we are today, where we have people marching into the Michigan Capitol with loaded ARs on their chest. My book opens with my own son being threatened by one of these Second Amendment patriots, air quotes around that. And I think about how important it is for Senator Murphy's legislation, imperfect perhaps, but it helps reestablish those norms that we once lived in under the nation.
Was there anything, Senator, in the process of writing this bill that you thought you could build on for next time, or if this conversation, if negotiations continue, 18 to 21 is the minimum age? I mean, does that seem like a realistic jump that you could get in a future bill?
Yeah, listen, I think we were very close to having 60 votes in the Senate to just simply raise the age to 21. We were a few votes short, and so we decided instead to set up this new process by which you'd run an enhanced background check on an 18 to 21-year-old buyer that institutes an effective waiting period, which I would argue could have been dispositive in a situation like Uvalde. But yeah, that's clearly the conversation that's happening right now. I think there is a growing tempest in this country, especially amongst parents and kids, to do something about assault weapons. I think there's an acknowledgement that the profile seems to be the same time and time again, young males, often under the age of 21. I don't think it'll be long before we have the votes to just raise the age, but I also think that some broader restrictions on that weapon are in our future as well. I just see this issue moving pretty quickly.
Do you, Ryan?
I think it's tough to debate that that gun and what is happening in and around that gun deserves special attention. I mean, come on. It's the industry wants to argue that it's just the same as every other gun. If it was, you would see every other gun ending up in places like Uvalde and Highland Park and Buffalo and Sutherland Springs and Las Vegas. Need I go on? Because I could for about another 15 minutes here. It's not the same as every other gun, and the way it's marketed and the sort of fear and intimidation that it exudes is not the same as every other gun. So I think it's very clear that we need some sort of extra attention on it.
Let me ask you this, Ryan. I mean, Ryan, I didn't mention it. Ryan wrote a great book called Gunfight, which is about there's a long subtitle, which you can, what's the subtitle?
My battle against the industry that radicalized America.
Okay, there's a subtitle. It's a good book. It's an inside look at his experience, basically from inside the industry. You had some striking anecdotes in there. Take us inside the mind, if you can, of, say it's 2020. There are long lines outside of like Walmart or wherever. Yeah. People are lined up for food, booze, toilet paper, and guns. Yeah. Perhaps, AR-15s. Yeah. What is going through that person's mind? Like, why? Why do you need a gun if we're all sitting at home during a pandemic?
So I think what everybody here, and I hope everybody in America needs to understand, is if you chart the change in the way guns are now sold and marketed with the sort of fear and radicalization, racism that we've seen become so widespread in our country, the two graphs mirror almost exactly. In 2007, before Barack Obama, just as Barack Obama started leading in the polls, America had never consumed more than 7 million guns in a single year. By the time, and really probably most of us think that's the time when our political radicalization really started to take hold. By the time Barack Obama left office, America was consuming almost 17 million guns a year, so it had more than doubled during the tenure of Barack Obama. Everybody I knew in the industry did not refer to him as President Obama. They called him America's best gun salesman. Then fast forward to 2020, probably the most tumultuous, fearful, conspiratorial sort of year any of us have ever lived through. That's the high water mark of gun sales in the United States. Americans consumed almost 23 million guns that year. So there is this very dangerous intertwining of guns and fear and conspiracy. And anybody who is fearful enough, for whatever reasons, will eventually go buy a gun or do something to address that fear. And so to your question, Mark, I think there's a lot of fear rolled up in a large majority of these gun sales.
Can I just put a quick postscript on this, and you do a wonderful job of talking about this. It is also still true that there are less households today that have guns than did 20 years ago. And it is also true that the majority of those weapons are being bought by a pretty small number of Americans. It is true in the last few years, the number of households having guns has increased, but here to 20 years ago, less households have guns. And the real story is a relatively small number of people that are loading up with a really high number of weapons. And I just think you have to understand that as the context here.
I'm going to ask Senator Murphy to help us understand the minds of some of your colleagues, which I realize can be a bit challenging in some ways. Talk to me about, you hear as an article of faith that the Republicans are terrified of the gun lobby. The NRA owns Senator XYZ. What does that look like from where you were sitting? When you talk to your colleagues, how does that intimidation or that hold that they do or do not have over your colleagues express itself? And has it changed at all? Is the sort of Darth Vader-like invincibility of the NRA any less so than it might have been a few years ago?
So I think it's really important to understand that the NRA's power is not, about the amount of money they contribute to candidates. It's about what that imprimatur means, right? The NRA endorsement has become a sort of proxy for a broader set of values. And for a Republican Party that is kind of post-ideas, right? This is a party that right now stands for one thing and one thing only, the destruction of government. Well, what can communicate to your primary constituents how much you care about the destruction of government other than the endorsement of the organization that supports the armed insurrection of the people against government. And so the sort of disintegration of ideas in the Republican Party leads to the primacy of the gun lobby because their endorsement sort of signals how much you hate government. But the answer to your second question is also yes. The gun lobby has less power today, and part of it is because they've fallen apart at the seams as an organization, but also more so because we just built a parallel organization, right? The anti-gun violence movement didn't exist 10 years ago, it does today, which leads a Republican senator to stand up in the middle of one of the caucuses that they're having considering the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and he stands up and he says to Cornyn and Tillis, why are you making us vote on this? I lose either way. I either have to vote against the gun lobby or I have to vote against my constituents. And that is a sentence that would have never been uttered 5 years ago in the Republican conference. They only feared one entity, and it was the gun lobby. Now they see there's equities on both sides.
Cornyn and Tillis, I was a little surprised by that. I mean, they both won 2 years ago, so they're safe for a while. But are there other gettables in sort of that category that you have talked to think could have some potential?
Every year there's more Republicans that are open to taking a look at these pieces of legislation, and it's simply a function of the politics on this changing. All of a sudden it's anti-gun violence advocates that are clogging up their phone lines and showing up at town halls, and you just naturally react to the voices you're hearing the most from. And even in places like Texas and North Carolina, all of a sudden we have equity with the other side. And so I think John and Tom came to this in part through that sort of interpretation of modern politics, but I will also say there's increasing emotional content, right? And it is harder, even for Republicans, to turn the other way when they have to meet constituent after constituent who has a personal story to tell. And I know that's part of the reason that John and Tom were at the table.
So that's an interesting segue. I mean, the notion of effective emotional content or whatever it was. I mean, we're talking about shootings. Shootings are awareness. I mean, they're horrifically tragic and no one likes them, but they propel the issue in some ways. Ryan and I were talking the other night about this. I mean, take me inside a gun company, like where you worked for so many years, when something like that happens. What do you expect to happen? What is a norm sort of in the 72 hours after one of these horrific things happens that you are all watching?
Well, the first thing that happens is any moderately human person hopes like hell it's not their gun that was in that shooting, and that usually rifles through every gun company. What did he use? And you're hoping.
You mean the brand?
The brand of gun, right? You're hoping it wasn't. You're hoping you didn't play a direct role in that gun, or in that shooting. Past that, there is a playbook that's going to happen. There's going to be a period of silence from the industry and the NRA, usually 5 to 7 days. They're going to let things calm down just a little bit. As soon as there's talk of legislative response, which there almost always is, certainly in the most horrific cases like the ones we've just lived through, then the response will then elicit a big demand spike. And after every shooting, there is a huge demand spike. Prior to this, something very sadly that Senator Murphy knows all too well about, the high point was after Sandy Hook. Sales shot through the roof. Literally, there are lines out of every single gun store in the country. Why? Because the NRA and the industry have so primed these consumers with so much fear and conspiracy that they believe that, the big bad black helicopter boogeyman is coming to steal every gun in every gun store within 5 days. And so they rush to purchase these things, and it creates an ongoing spike, sometime for months. And if you look at gun sales through the last 15 to 18 years, a week or so after every shooting, you see a big spike.
Senator, I mean, your state, obviously, in Newtown, were you in the Senate then? You were in the Senate then.
I was just been elected to the Senate, but that was my congressional district.
Given how emotional and raw and horrific this is, when you're dealing with victims of gun violence like this, as you do, how do you stay, how do you keep from getting numb? And how do you stay outraged, but also how do you stay constructive?
Listen, I mean, obviously I'm an interloper to all of this. I haven't experienced this in my personal life, and I just find these advocates absolutely heroic. I mean, I can't imagine how these parents from Sandy Hook or New Haven or Hartford have the emotional strength to deal with the grief and come to Washington to protest. I guess I see the anti-gun violence movement in the same frame as I would look at any other great social change movement, the civil rights movement, the marriage equality movement. And those are movements that have lots of failures up front. And they are just so convinced of the righteousness of their cause that they eventually prevail. I also know that the last time we passed a substantial measure was in 1993 and 1994. That's 10 years after the event that precipitated at that time the rise of the most recent anti-gun violence movement, the attempted assassination of President Reagan. So that was 10 years from the time that James Brady was shot to the passage of the Brady handgun bill. So I see a historical scope, which makes me understand that sometimes you just got to stick with this.
Ryan, I guess, seeing that you live in the belly of the beast, what gives you hope on this issue, if anything?
Well, so the grand total of any internal firearms industry dissent is represented by the 352 pages that are in my book, right? I'm the only person that's ever spoke out against the industry after being inside of it. And we were quite worried about the sort of blowback that might elicit on myself, my family, my two boys, who are both in public schools in Kalispell, Montana, where we live. We prepared all sorts of safety. We had safety talks and digital safety and everything else. We anticipated just a wave of trolling and attacks, but the opposite happened. We thought it would be 50-1 trolling to praise, and instead, right after the news of the book was leaked, I got up and I told Sarah over breakfast, oh my God, like there's 20 thank yous and long letters and heartfelt notes from West Texas ranchers and Pennsylvania hunters, and that hasn't stopped, and it's coming in waves. And I do get the occasional, super thoughtful, a couple four-letter words, and like those. I do get those, and occasionally some threatening stuff. But I'm getting waves of this support, and it tells me that there really is this vast, frustrated majority out there. I mean, I think what Senator Murphy did. Look, he got 65 senators to vote yes on something. I mean, as I say, you couldn't get 65 senators to vote yes that ice cream's good, but he got them to do it on this. Like there's something bubbling up in society that is allowing a senator like this to do good work. And it's tough, and we live in a democracy where things happen in the gray area, and it's not going to be perfect, and there's not a great solution, but he's making it better, and I feel that frustration in society is helping that.
Senator, do you ever feel intimidated?
By the issue or by the industry?
Both, or just by the threat level that we deal with today and the prevalence of guns.
Oh, sure I do. Welcome to my world, right? So, yeah, listen, this job is scarier than it used to be, right? The level of hate and viciousness, frankly, the number of weapons that are out there is just different. So. Certainly in the days after this bill passed, I and my family, similarly, I've got young kids, we had to take precautions that, nobody should, have to take in this business. But, organically, I feel, the same thing that Ryan does. There's, 10 times as many people egging me on and telling me to do more as there are, trying to come after me. But, this is a volatile time, and there's no issue that's more volatile than this. So I certainly, live wondering whether there's somebody out there whose screws are coming loose who thinks that I'm trying to take their guns. We all have to be careful.
Guess we have time. No one's telling us to leave yet. Tell me, Senator, what is? I'll ask you the hope question. I mean, what gives you hope on this issue?
Yeah, I think this summer gives me hope. Right? I mean. It is heartbreaking that we could only pass as much as we could this summer, but that's 10 times as much as we could have gotten done just 5 years ago. I really see this issue moving very, very quickly. The fact that Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming said the week after Uvalde that she was considering voting for the bill because calls were running 10-1 from Wyoming in favor of the bill, tells you that America has made a decision. And people like Tom Tillis and John Cornyn give me hope, right? You do need, on an issue like this, some heroes. You do need some people who are willing to sort of step out and do something difficult first. And we now have those. We have handfuls of Republicans that are willing to take some chances. And I And I think the last thing that gives me hope is that I don't think any of the Republicans who voted for this feel like they're sustaining any significant backlash for it back home. In fact, from what I understand, most of them are finding out what Ryan found out, that they actually have some new friends that they didn't suspect, and their enemies just don't seem to be that well organized, at least as well organized as they thought they would be. So what also gives me hope is that the folks who did step out on a limb this summer are feeling pretty good about it right now. And that gives me confidence that there's a next chance, a next bite at this apple pretty soon.
Ryan, what piece of advice would you or have you given to people like Senator Murphy on how strategically to approach this issue based on what you've seen in the last few years in Washington, but also how you see what's been effective from your industry position?
And I was honored to brief Senator Murphy and many other senators on this, and I gave them a couple pieces of advice. One, I am hopeful. I see the same hopeful signs and experience the same things that I just noted and Senator did. At the same time, I'm deadly worried about the extent to which armed political radicals may want to and may use guns to upend our democracy. I'm very worried about that. And I think what we have to do is stop thinking that we can solve this in one fell swoop. That's why I'm, such a big fan of what the senator did. We got into this through 30 years of bad decisions that made things marginally worse each time we made those decisions. We're not going to fix it with one, or in fact, we may never fix it. This is, again, a democracy that will live in the gray space. What we can do is start making decisions that make things marginally better. And we did that. Senator Murphy did that. There's lots more decisions that we can make, and we have to reestablish these norms of responsibility in and around gun ownership. It's an immense, unbelievably powerful freedom. It cannot exist in a democracy like ours if it's not balanced with commensurate responsibility. So we either have to do that through norms or legislation has to do it for us. So I'm very heartened by these small steps we're taking.
Senator, is there anything you feel like you could strategically do differently based on what you've seen, what's worked, what hasn't worked in some of these previous bills, like how different approaches you might take?
Well, I think there's a real opportunity in the radicalization of the gun lobby, right? So you have a lot of gun owners out there who, have stopped paying their dues to the NRA, that feel like there's a level of regulation that is completely commensurate with the maintenance of their rights. I think we've got to do a better job of reaching out to them. Sometimes we just make an assumption as progressives, right, that gun owners are going to be lined up on the other side of our politics. That's not true, and we shouldn't continue to make that assumption. And then I'm not sure how much it will matter, but I do think we have to pierce this mythology that everything we're doing is a slippery slope to confiscation. So I'm somebody that believes the Second Amendment does protect the right of private gun ownership. I'm not sure that everybody in my party agrees. Some think it's just about militias, but I think it'd be wise for our movement to concede that we believe in sort of the basic definitions of Heller, that everybody's got a right to own a gun for protection or to hunt or shoot for sport, but we think that there's plenty of space for government to regulate that right to protect the safety of human beings. I think that's what our founders believed, but if we were a little bit more clear about what we believe we can do and what we can't do, perhaps we could sort of pierce the strength of this argument that the right makes that, hey, you're just seeing a snippet of their agenda. Really what they're trying to do is bring those black helicopters in and take all your guns away.
Right. I'll put this to both of you. Is there anything that we are doing in a society that is sort of performatively maybe excessive as far as having kids go under desks and sort of doing a lot of this sort of armed shooter drills that our kids have now gone through? I mean, is there anything that sort of is over the top? Is there anything that sort of leads people to maybe a greater level of emotional sort of just sort of hysteria, basically, than is necessary?
I mean, listen, similar to Ryan, I have 2 kids in public schools. I don't want them going to schools in places that feel and look like prisons. I actually think that's bad for their educational health. I also think it's important to be honest with families that while you're watching a lot of mass shootings in schools, you are still much more likely to die from a falling object than you are to die in a mass shooting. That doesn't make any of this less psychically cataclysmic when you see it, but it means that you maybe don't need to turn the entire country into a sort of armed camp. And then just to remember that all the data tells us more guns equal more violence. So putting more guns into schools, for instance, or putting more guns into office buildings or churches, no evidence that that actually leads to people being more safe. All evidence suggests that that ends up with people being less safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in some ways I agree with Senator Murphy, and in other ways, I don't think we should normalize any of this stuff. I don't think we should look away from it. I don't think we should minimize the emotional response to how dangerous it is and how detestable it is to have our kids hiding under desks. It's, I don't want to live in that country. And so we have to find a balance. I don't want it to be emotionally overwrought. But normalizing this idea, again, that people can march in the Michigan Capitol with loaded guns, or these sort of things that we seem to be kind of normalizing in America and looking away from, and just like, well, that's just the cost of. No, it's not. We don't have to say that's okay. So I would like to see us not look away and not normalize that stuff.
Could I ask you a question about working in a large gun company? Did any of your coworkers feel ashamed of this, or was there any cognitive dissonance in the day-to-day of their life, given where the information is?
So through my time in the industry, those who did, not just at my company, but they generally kind of, two things happened. They sort of quietly went away, left the industry, did whatever, or you became true believers. And there is this rationalization, much like we see on the political right now. I think Mark, you probably asked us many times, like, does this guy at the podium, does he really believe this crazy stuff? And over time, they do actually come to like truly believe it, because it's the only way you can exist, or you can be me and be troubled for 15 years and end up writing a book about it. But many of these people do have actually come to be true believers, and that's sad for me.
I guess last question. I mean, Senator, have you seen anything similar in your workplace with some of your Republican colleagues? I mean, do they really believe this stuff?
Well, it's funny. I give that same answer all the time, because when I'm back home or traveling the country, everybody's sort of first question, especially in the last 6 years, has been, well, what do Republicans tell you when the lights and the cameras are off? And I give the same answer. I say, listen, there are a handful of them that think this is all bonkers and nuts and will tell you so. But most of them leave. The folks that are there now who have stuck it out since 2016, they are by and large bought in to the Trump agenda, to much of the gun lobby's agenda. And so you don't get a lot of folks who tell you one thing privately and then show up on the cable news shows and tell you something else. On guns, I think it'll be much more likely that people do the right thing simply because they know that they're putting their reelection at risk if they do the wrong thing. I don't know that you'll see a lot of moral conversions on this issue. It's just that the politics are changing, and when the politics change on an issue, all of a sudden, as democracy is supposed to happen in a democracy, legislators start to change their behavior.
Senator Murphy, Ryan, thank you for being with us. It's a great conversation.
Thank you, Mark.
Buy Ryan's book. Thanks for being here, guys.